Hello, and welcome to my podcast, Unique Scotland, which gives you an insight into the real Scotland, its people, amazing places to visit, be they castles, palaces, battlefields, or simply talk about the incredible landscapes of mountains and valleys, which we call glens, by the way, and the lochs or lakes as you will know them. My intention is to take you on a journey, sharing with you, over the next months and years, all that Scotland has to offer. Perhaps your future tours of Scotland may be shaped by some of what you discover here, or if you can't come to Scotland, then I hope you can imagine this magical land. And if you wanted more information on a particular place, just let me know. I'd love to hear from you, and I can tell you all about it in a future podcast. If you heard my last podcast on Scotland, the place, then you will have listened to where we Scots came from. In this podcast, I want to talk to you about the Scottish people, where they come from, what are their historic roots, what has shaped their lives over thousands of years, and what shapes their lives today. What do they like? What don't they like? I'd also like to dispel or confirm some of the myths surrounding the Scottish character. And for those of you wondering what is worn under a Scotsman's kilt, you may be in for a surprise. And considering Scotland is such a small country with only 5.5 million people, why are there 4 separate regions, and why are they so different? I'm a lowlander, for example, and my cousins come from the Northern Highlands and the Islands. Is there a difference? Ya betcha. Well, relax wherever you are and enjoy your unique tours of Scotland and today's short podcast on the Scottish people. It always makes me smile when a fellow Scot tells me that he is a real Scot. I've got a good friend called Angus. Yes, I know it's a lovely Scottish name. When I ask him what he thinks that means, he'll say to me, I was born here, or as were my parents and grandparents. But I'll ask the question again, yes, Angus, but where does your family really originate from? This usually annoys the hell out of Angus, and he'll go off ranting about me not understanding his true Scottish heritage or the true heritage of the Scots. And I'll probably get a 2-fingered salute as he disappears around the corner. In fact, I'm not trying to be obtuse, it's just that I see it slightly differently. For those who listened to my last podcast on Scotland the place, you'll recall that I told you that 500 million years ago, Scotland was part of a tectonic plate floating well south of the equator. Well, you'd be glad to know that we don't need to go that far back. Anyway, it'll only annoy Angus. But to find out the origins of the Scots, we have to go back to the end of the last ice age, about 10,000 years ago. As it happens, it was probably about 8,000 years ago, when hunter-gatherers came into Scotland from the south. There was no English Channel then, that's the sea channel running between the south of England and France. So roaming tribes, or the hunter-gatherers as they were called, could just walk directly across from Europe to this new land that would become Great Britain, with Scotland in the north. And they could hunt on the lands that they found on their travels. It's not known exactly when man inhabited the Scotland we know and love, but there is much archaeological evidence of the hunter-gatherer who inhabited the land about 6,000 years ago. These were the Neolithic people, or the New Stone Age. Overall, it took a couple of thousand years for these tribes to get tired of chasing their prey all over the place, all the time, until someone had a great idea to capture the prey live and keep it penned up until it was needed. Growing of crops became a great pastime, and we suddenly went from hunter-gatherer to farmer. So, in reality, this was the first link in the chain, but it's only the start. The great thing about this Neolithic people is that they left behind some wonderful buildings and artefacts. For example, their burial cairns, which effectively is a large pile of rocks or boulders on top of stone coffins, or kists as we call them. There are many standing stones on their own in lonely fields, and also groups of possible places of worship with stone circles that somehow relate to exact positioning of the sun and the moon. They are testament to the Neolithic man's presence, and are fascinating places for you to visit when you come over. So the point I try to make to Angus is that his earliest ancestors were from abroad, in what we now know as Europe. However, that's just a tiny part of the story. And I fast forward to 2,000 years ago when we find Scotland inhabited by tribes whose original name we actually don't know. They lived mainly on the more arable east coast, and these guys were just happily getting on with their lives when the Romans arrived in the south of England in the 1st century AD. Now the Romans conquered and garrisoned South Britain, or England as we know it today, But on their travels north, they were stopped in their tracks by troublesome and fierce tribes, the indigenous people of North Britain. It was actually the Romans who gave these tribes their name, the Picts, or the Painted People, a relatively primitive society, probably not dissimilar to tribes of Native Americans who also had tribal lifestyles and painted their bodies. While I'm mentioning the name Pict given to those tribes by the Romans, it's also worth mentioning that they also gave us the name Caledonia, which is an alternative name for Scotland. Roman archives describe the territory north of Britannia as Caledon. So the next time you sing the song Caledonia, it was the Romans in the 1st century that gave us that name. Anyway, the Romans did not conquer North Britain or Scotland, I'm delighted to say. Indeed, their northern neighbours were so problematic that they built a huge wall from coast to coast in the 2nd century, almost along the same line of the Scottish-English border today, and this was called Hadrian's Wall, after a Roman emperor. It was not unsubstantial at 73 miles long, with 17 large forts, 18 mile castles, as they were called, and 2 turrets between the mile castles. They controlled southern Scotland by building a second wall 40 years later called the Antonine Wall, after another Roman emperor. But as much as they tried, and there were on occasion some Roman incursions into the north, there was never an outright victory. There will, however, have been mixing of the gene pool, that's for sure. And you know something, when I look at Angus sometimes, especially from the side, I just see a wee bit of Italian in him. The Romans were only in Britannia for a couple of hundred years, and in the 3rd century they had to dash off to defend their diminishing empire, while the Picts continued to thrive. With the Romans gone, there was more mixing with the Britons in the south and the Angles, the people that effectively make up the English. And this general peace continued until a major upheaval from Ireland in the west. The Gaels arrived from Ireland in the 6th and 7th century, and they were preceded by an extremely influential Irish priest, the famous St. Columba, Columcille as he's known, Dove of the Church, and he and his followers were effectively responsible for the conversion of the Pictish pagan communities to Christianity all over Scotland. His base was the wonderful and peaceful island of Iona, where a fine abbey stands today on a low-lying grassy enclosure with a wonderful white sandy beach a short walk away. It's a place of serenity, and when you come to Scotland, it's just one of the places that you must visit. It's actually just off the southern tip of Mull, which is a 5-minute crossing on a small ferry. And as I sit here, I can imagine the abbey up on the hill. I can hear the gulls above me. I can hear the waves lapping against the shore. And I can smell the fresh, salt sea air. There's so much more to say about Iona and Mull, and I'd like to share that with you in a future podcast. This part of the story is crucial, because it was incursions by the warring Gaels from the west that changed the entire face of Scotland at that time. Within a couple of hundred years of the Gaels arriving, the Picts effectively disappear from the map of Scotland, and very little is known about them, their language, rituals or way of life. There is little written about the Picts, and all that remains to show that they did exist are the Roman scripts, and also on the Scottish landscape we do find large stone obelisks or Pictish stones with amazing markings and symbols that have yet to be fully understood. The Picts' sudden disappearance from history is a mystery that has completely eluded historians. The main assumption is that they were assimilated into Gaelic culture. There have been suggestions of a mass slaughter of the community, but I think any suggestion of slaughter by the Gaels is fanciful, and probably assimilation over a couple of hundred years is more realistic. In any event, the gene pool was well and truly mixed again, and this is the time when Scotland started becoming more of the one nation we recognise today, with the second most famous Gael, after St. Columba, Kenneth MacAlpine, or Kenneth I, who reputedly was the first king of Scots. Also, the name Scotland is derived from the Latin Scoti, the term applied to Gaels or particular tribes that sailed from Ireland to raid Roman Britain. The derivation of the word Scoti is uncertain, but it has been found in Latin text from the 4th century. The main reason for the Gaels moving east, apart from expanding their empire, was because of incursions into their own lands by fearsome warriors from Norway, Sweden, Denmark, and other Scandinavian countries, and they were called the Vikings. Their reputation for vicious attacks on peaceful communities went before them. The beautiful, peaceful island of Iona that I mentioned before was attacked several times, with many of the monks and clerics murdered simply to steal the valuables of the religious community. If any of you heard of the famous Book of Kells, which was an amazing illustrated gospel book in Latin, well, that was created at Iona in the 8th or 9th century, and because of the continued threat of Viking raids, it was moved to Ireland for safekeeping, and that's where this remains today. So if you're ever visiting Dublin, pop into Trinity College Library to have a look at it. It's spectacular. Anyway, I digress. The Vikings over time ruled the Western Isles and also much of the western seaboard, retaining power there for some 300 years. They were finally brought to heel in the 13th century when King Alexander III of Scotland defeated the Norwegian King Haakon at the Battle of Largs. After peace treaties were signed, the Viking lords, who had ruled the West for so long, became subjects to the Scottish crown and quietly settled down to lives as local landlords. If only. Some of these lords became the leaders of some of the most powerful clans in Scotland, such as the MacDonalds and MacLeods from the Isle of Skye, and remained a thorn in the side of the monarchy for many years. By the way, Mac simply means son of, so the son of Leod became Mac Leod, or MacLeod is how we pronounce it. You'll often hear the term Norse or Norseman. Well, the only difference between a Viking and a Norseman is that the Viking has finally stopped his raping, killing and stealing and settles down to a more homely life, once more adding to that gene pool. Angus is shaking his head now, but I tell him to stick around because the Scot of today is finally taking shape. And what a Scot that becomes. Sorry that the story so far has been at quite a pace, but we have just covered 1200 years of the history of the Scottish people. It's now worth pausing and looking at the next 800 years, where, as I said to Angus, the Scot of today is more connected to that time. So, it's now the 12th century. Kingship of a united Scotland has been established, and by that I mean the Highlands and Islands and Lowlands, in the main, recognise one king. His stronghold is now the castle in the capital of Scotland, Edinburgh. In England, they had already gone through the upheaval of the Norman conquest in the 11th century, and the French Normans were ruling a relatively peaceful and well-organised society. While the Scottish King David recognised the Norman abilities, especially their building capabilities, and the design of the 12th century castles we see today in Scotland are from about that time. Well, King David invited some of the most successful and powerful French Norman families to settle in Scotland, with land and title as an inducement. One of the most powerful families were the de Bruces, who were given lands in the southwest of Scotland, and everyone will have heard of the most famous Bruce of them all, Robert the Bruce, who was one of the most courageous warriors of his generation. This is also the time of the Scottish Wars of Independence against the English, of Braveheart, William Wallace, Mel Gibson, and by the way I thought his accent wasn't too bad, and the Battle of Stirling Bridge. After Wallace's gruesome execution, Robert the Bruce stands up and wins a decisive battle at Bannockburn against a larger and more powerful English army who had been occupying Scotland at that time. The battles that I mention, their aftermath, and how Scotland fared after those battles are worthy of another podcast by themselves, so watch this space. Of course, this was also the time that foreign trade from the near continent was a regular feature of Scotland, and many of those foreigners settled here. Some were invited across to assist with land improvement, for example in the 19th century, and a good example of that is the transforming of peat bog land to arable land by removing the moss and the peat. It was people from Holland who knew everything there was to know about water control who were invited to Scotland to help us out. And there's still a place near Stirling today that's called Flanders Moss, which reflects the Dutch influence in the area. Another considerable influence on the gene pool at that time was the Old Alliance, or as the Scots called it, the Auld Alliance, and that was an alliance made in the 13th century between Scotland and France for the purpose of controlling England's numerous invasions. It remained in place until the signing of the Treaty of Edinburgh in the 16th century. Some of our kings went to France to search for suitable wives. The most famous probably was James V, whose daughter Mary Queen of Scots became Queen of France, albeit for only a year. Dear oh dear, Mary Queen of Scots, what a story of love, betrayal, murder, incarceration and beheading by an English queen. There we have it, the Scot we know today, with the genes of multiple societies, and that's not to mention the recent wars where huge swathes of Europeans fled their countries to escape the tyranny of Nazism, and only just recently the large numbers of people coming to us from all over the world, with Middle Eastern refugees being the most recent. So Angus, what is your heritage? What is a real Scot? Now that we hopefully understand where we came from, I'd like to talk about the Scot of today. What makes them tick? What are their characteristics? How do they differ from other parts of the United Kingdom? And who will you find here when you visit? And exactly what is worn under a Scotsman's kilt? So, for those of you who have not travelled to Scotland, what's your image of a Scotsman or a Scotswoman? Is it indeed the Highland warrior, a painted face, blue with a white St Andrew's cross, in a kilt carrying his targe or shield and hilted broadsword drawn in one hand and his dirk in the other, running wild-eyed with a warrior cry, screaming down upon would-be invaders, the sound of bagpipes perhaps swirling in the background? Well, I certainly hope not, as we wouldn't see many tourists if that's how you were greeted at Edinburgh Airport. We come in all shapes and sizes and nationalities, so let me give you an idea of what makes up a Scot, and firstly let's look at the 4 main regions of Scotland that I mentioned earlier. There's the Borders, the Central Lowlands, the Highlands and the Islands. The Borderers. They're a solitary lot really, and that's probably because they're separated from the rest of Scotland by a range of hills called the Southern Uplands. The English border is on the other side, so that might make them a wee bit nervous. They seem a bit aloof at times and often suspicious of any incomers. I'm not sure if that has anything to do with the treatment by invading armies in the Middle Ages. The problem for the Borderers was that they got a kicking when the invading English armies came into Scotland, and they got another kicking when the English armies returned home. It was tough, and they have never forgotten it. The Central Lowlanders, the region we call the Central Belt, that takes in Edinburgh and Glasgow, they consider themselves to be superior and more educated Scots, and have for centuries looked upon their near neighbours in the Highlands and Islands as savages. However, there are tensions amongst themselves in that the Central Lowlands are made up mainly of Edinburgh in the east and Glasgow in the west, and never the twain shall meet. There's a mutual distrust, and whereas the Edinburghers look down upon the Glaswegians for their working-class roots from the Industrial Revolution, the Glaswegians look upon the Edinburghers as upper-class toffs who run the banks, have the castle, the Queen's Palace at Holyrood, and run Parliament. There is a story told by a Glaswegian that if you arrive unannounced at a Glaswegian's door, he will say, "Welcome, come in and have your dinner." If you arrive unannounced at an Edinburgher's door, he will say, "Welcome, come in, you'll have had your dinner." A real love-hate relationship. Then there are the Highlanders, a proud race and ready to take up the sword again if called upon to do so. They look down on the Lowlanders as traitors to the cause, the people who sold them out in 1707 when Scotland became part of Great Britain. They call them Sassenachs at any opportunity. The word Sassenach is often a term used to describe an Englishman, so it's a real insult to a Scottish Lowlander. The Islanders, they're softly spoken people. They keep themselves to themselves. They've got a nice lilt, and many still speak Gaelic. They like to be nicely isolated in their island homes, and prefer if the Edinburgh parliamentary elite leave them alone. They live by and large by the old ways, and although they enjoy all the latest mod cons, they are totally self-sufficient. If they were cut off from the mainland, they would easily look after themselves. Now I do, of course, greatly generalise, so to all you Scots listening, with one or two perhaps steaming up, this opinion is entirely mine, and I caveat it all with the word allegedly to stop the legal writs pouring in. OK, looking at us Scots, I would now like to confirm or dispel a few myths. Let me first talk about kilts. Strangely enough, you won't often see many Scots wearing kilts. I always do for 6 months of the year when I'm guiding, but I believe one should be dressed appropriately if showing someone around your country. The only time you'll normally see a Scot wearing a kilt is usually at a wedding or a funeral, or a special occasion such as a Highland Games. Having said that, some of the far northern areas and the Islanders will still have some kilted Scots, but normally of the older generation. I can also guarantee they will not be carrying a sword, a dirk, which is a long dagger, or a skean-dhu, a smaller dagger normally tucked into a Scotsman's sock. It's against the law. Indeed, any weapon carrying in the United Kingdom is against the law. I've had many an interesting chat with my American guests on the differences between our country's gun laws here, for example. If you're caught with a handgun in the United Kingdom, any sort of handgun, without being a member of, say, a shooting club, and you have an appropriate licence, it's an automatic jail sentence. And of course, our police do not carry guns either, unless specially trained, and even then only at places of high population density, such as airports, train stations, etc. Do we all play the bagpipes? No, very few do. I think we all like the bagpipes, although that is a personal choice. The national dish is the haggis, a meal for the poor in the past, because the higher echelons of society ate the meat and the poor were given the offal. Haggis is actually made from heart, liver, lungs, all minced up with onion, oatmeal, spices, and traditionally encased in a sheep's stomach, and then it's boiled and cut open to eat the meat inside once it's done. It's really quite yummy. I think most Scots do like haggis, but it's normally only eaten once a year to celebrate the great poet Robert Burns. You know, the man who wrote Auld Lang Syne that everyone sings at New Year. You can also get deep-fried haggis at local fish and chip shops, but I don't recommend it. Similarly, you can buy the deep-fried Mars bars here. However, once again, I don't recommend it. However, they are quite good stomach fillers if you're going out for a good night's drinking. And talking about drinking, the average younger Scot will be drinking beer or lager or a mixture of cocktail, not so much whisky. That's for the slightly older generation who in the main will drink blended whisky such as Grouse or Bell's. A single malt whisky is usually reserved for special occasions, not surprisingly as it costs twice as much. The younger generation of Scots are impervious to the cold, wind, rain, hail, and they only wear a t-shirt in almost any weather, and that's a trait of a hardy Scot. Red hair. There has been a suggestion that all Scots have red hair. In fact, only 13% do, although a Scottish DNA project that was completed not so long ago indicated that 40% of Scots had the red hair gene. Well, I think that's a real Gael or Irish influence. I'm often asked about clans, and I'll probably go into this in more detail in later podcasts. But the clan demise really came in 1746, after Bonnie Prince Charlie was routed at Culloden by the British Army. And once again, that's another story for another day. But in practical terms, I think quite a few Scots will have some sort of alliance with their clan name, but there's no longer an allegiance to any chief. The word clan simply means children, and in the past, clans were united in a kind of kinship under one name and in one particular area. Kinsmen would live under the protection of the chief, and the clansman would offer his hand with a sword when called upon to do so. Do all Scots have clans and clan allegiances? Well, I think the Highland clearances probably put paid to that, but there are still pockets of clan members, those with the same surname in Scotland, particularly in the Highlands and Islands. I know when I visit my ancestral home in Mackay country, there are still many Mackay families who live there. You'll find MacLeans on Mull, MacDonalds and MacLeods still on Skye. I could go on, but the strong bond between these individuals and their clan chief really no longer exists. However, there are still clan societies in Scotland, and there's occasional gatherings. And when I tour Scotland with my guests, I try to take them to discover their Scottish roots and also try to visit their ancient homelands. There's also clan societies all over the world, and some of you listening to this may well have visited Scotland to attend a clan gathering which keeps the connection with Scotland alive. Looking at today, you'll find the Scots a determined people with a fighting spirit about them. But it still does not answer the question, how on earth did they effectively defeat the Romans, the Vikings, and ultimately the powerful English armies of the 14th century? Well, there's a thing called battle-hardened. It's a military phrase. It's when an army has been in action regularly and becomes a bit blasé about bullets flying about their heads. It's all about being used fighting high-intensity warfare. Now, the Scots were always battle-hardened, ready to fend off any invading army, because they were always fighting against themselves, for any reason, mostly over land and power. But in reality, they didn't need a reason. It was sport. It was almost gladiatorial. I asked a neighbour recently what he thought about the Scots' character, and he said they just don't like each other. Each region calls the other region names. If you're in a pub in Glasgow and you come from Edinburgh, you'll end up in an argument. Scots are forever bickering amongst themselves, and it's good that swords are no longer legal weapons to be carried, and we, the Scots, remain bickering, arguing and fighting, until, of course, that is, some other nation stands on our toes. Then we come together as one, a strong, proud and battle-hardened nation, to fend off the invader. I generalise, of course. So what is the character of a real Scot? Well, we're warm and welcoming, with an apparent cold exterior, but an extremely warm heart. We're witty and can laugh at ourselves, especially in adversity. We're frugal without being tight-fisted. We're straight-talking. We're brave. We don't suffer fools gladly. We're deep thinkers, creative, artistic, and we're also romantic in our own unique Scottish way. We're storytellers, we're inventors, for example penicillin, TV, telephone, to mention but a few. Philanthropists, look at Andrew Carnegie. And for my American friends, yes, Andrew Carnegie was born in Scotland. Poets such as Robert Burns, economists, Adam Smith, who wrote The Wealth of Nations, and philosophers such as David Hume. Generally a race apart, but with a zeal for being together. We're also known for our hard work and determination, confident that we can overcome any odds. For example, when the Mackays emigrated to America, they were well known for their honesty and hard work. They'd been raised in extreme hardship under the very difficult conditions of the far north of Scotland. So if you wanted a job well done, you asked for a Mackay, which became known as the real Mackay, or as we know it today, the real McCoy. There's just one other story of fortitude that I must tell you, and it's about a man called Callum MacLeod. And I smile always when I hear this story. Well, he lived in the north of the island of Raasay, just to the west of Skye, and his community had asked the local authority to build a 2-mile road to replace the old animal track from their village in the north to join the official road in the south. Well, after decades of unsuccessful campaigning and several failed grant applications, Callum got up one morning, said nothing to his wife, went to his shed, collected his shovel, pick and wheelbarrow, and started to build the road himself. It took him 10 years, working every day, to replace the old narrow footpath, to turn it into a road, and his achievement, which has stood the test of time, can still be seen today. So coming back to Angus's difficulty with what a real Scot is, our genes tell us that the real Scot does not need to be born here. He probably lives here, or has lived here, or has a connection with someone who has lived here even in the distant past. A Scot is a Scot at heart. It's a state of mind. I know what I am and where I come from. It's quite exciting to think that there's an amazing mix of Neolithic hunter-gatherers from Europe, the Picts, the Romans, the Gaels, and many more nationalities that have passed through or settled in Scotland that make up my genes. And I have a message for you. If you are one of the 40 million Scottish diaspora anywhere in the world, then you understand exactly what I mean. You can feel it in your blood. You belong here and will always be welcome. There's also good news for the rest of the non-Scottish community around the world as well. You will also be made most welcome too. Now, before I sign off, I promised to let you know what is worn under a Scotsman's kilt. The answer is nothing. It is all in perfect working order. Well, thank you for listening, and now you have listened to my podcasts Scotland the Place and now Scotland the People. My next podcast will be taking you on a virtual tour starting in Edinburgh, up through St Andrews, via Dunkeld and Pitlochry, up to Inverness. There's lots to see and do, so I look forward to you joining me on that journey next week.
You've been listening to the Unique Scotland podcast with exclusivescottishvisits.co.uk. To receive all our episodes automatically, please subscribe now.